Was he calling my name? I guess it's my turn. The question before us this morning is, what's gratitude got to do with it? The answer? Everything. Well, let's explore that a little bit. Generosity and gratitude, how do they go together? Like a ship in its sails, like a horse in its carriage. Indeed, for me, you can't talk about one without talking about the other. Generosity and gratitude. Some would say that when we're grateful, then we're generous with our lives, our money and our time and our energy and our ideas. Others might say that when we are generous with our money and our time and our energy and our ideas, then we can't help but be grateful. In sharing ourselves, we are more apt to feel better about ourselves, and thus we can be in touch with our own gratitude for being able to help others, to support the work of the church. I don't know for sure, but I think it's much more organic, actually, than that. And in our continuing text this morning, we hear Mark Scandiretti's give credit to his father, who, according to Mark, taught him that generosity begets gratefulness, and gratefulness begets a sense of abundance. So maybe it's the sense of abundance rather than scarcity that promotes gratefulness, which in turn inspires us to give generously. What does Mark say about his father? He was not afraid of giving too much or running out, though he never had much himself. I love that image. In the first work group back in 1990 that I took to Honduras in our Catoctin Association partnership, there was a man, this was in 1990. There was a man named Merle in our group, and he was in his late 60s at the time. And we went to Honduras. We lived with families, very, very, very poor families, and we helped build a neighborhood, really, to help build houses like the Habitat style in some ways. And after about 10 days, after Merle's return to Middletown, he was convinced he would never, ever do that again. Too much out of his comfort zone. But guess what? He signed up for the next trip in January the following year. Sometime shortly after that first trip, he talked with Pat Hanberry about the experience, and Merle doesn't remember what it was that Pat said to him, but somehow she got into his very soul about the power of the project, and he felt to go back again. Thank you, Pat, thank you for sharing that, whatever it was with Merle, what you moved him. The following year, sometime during the second trip, Merle said to me, "You know, Gerry, I never thought I had very much until I started giving it away." And he gave his life away for 13 more trips, gave hundreds and hundreds of dollars to support the program, convinced his physician doctor out in the Midwest to give thousands and to support that work. I've seen Merle strike up a conversation. He didn't speak a word of Spanish, but if he met an older person on the street or in some place we were, he would strike up this conversation with a man who didn't speak any English, and somehow they'd get to know each other. Because Merle's heart and soul was there in that project. Honestly, the more Merle gave, the more he got out of his comfort zone, the more he was challenged, the more he was inspired to share his life and his gratitude with the people of Honduras. As Merle's gratitude grew, so did his courage, and so did his compassion. It seems, therefore, that generosity and gratitude have something to do with compassion. Jesus, in many, many stories in the Gospels, has compassion for the people. In the case of our gospel lesson from Matthew today, out of Jesus' compassion, he is very generous. Generous with his time and energy, with his teaching. Can you imagine, with the news of the horrible death of John the Baptist, which had just come to Jesus shortly before this, he takes his disciples up into the hills to find a quiet place to rest and to grieve. But it never did turn out that way. Jesus didn't have very good boundaries, you know. He didn't know how to take care of himself very well. Although he tried. All of a sudden there were thousands of people there surrounding him, trying to touch him, trying to get him to touch them. And the feeding of the multitudes, which is the story from the feeding of the 5,000, was clearly important to the gospel writers because aside from the resurrection, it is the only miracle recorded by all 4 gospel writers. However, it is important to note that both Matthew and Mark record 2 different feeding stories or miracles to huge crowds. The first in Matthew for 5,000 people and even more than women and children, and 5,000 men and even more women and children for sure. And then in Mark, we have the miracle of Jesus feeding 4,000. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a lonely place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go to the villages and buy food for themselves." But here's what happens instead. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, Jesus looked up to heaven and blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children, the text says. And they had 5 loaves left over. Then Jesus called the disciples to him, this is from Matthew 15, and said, "I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat, and I am unwilling to send them away hungry, lest they faint on their way." And commanding the crowd to sit down on the ground, let me say it again, and you know these words. You hear them every first Sunday of the month. Having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Why did Matthew and Mark include 2 miracles of the same kind? After all, if Jesus had already fed 5,000 people, what is really added to the gospel story by adding another feeding miracle of a little smaller number. It seems odd. Wouldn't it have been better to use that precious ink and parchment to record some different miracle? Some would say, well, location, location, location. The feeding of the 4,000 is important because where it took place. The feeding of the 5,000 took place near Bethsaida, close to the Sea of Galilee. And in contrast, the feeding of the 4,000 took place in the region of the Gerasenes, in the region around Decapolis. Okay, so the two miracles took place in different regions. So what? So what? It is important because the first region was Jewish and the second region was Gentile. Maybe this is more than you want to know, but there are some numerical clues in the text which are important in this distinction. Numbers in the Bible are rarely accidental or incidental. The feeding of the 5,000, in this miracle, Jesus takes 5 loaves and feeds 5,000, which is reminiscent of the 5 books of the Jewish law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Not only that, but when everyone had finished eating, 12 baskets of leftovers were collected, which was probably alluding to the 12 tribes of Israel. In the feeding of the 4,000, in this second miracle, 7 loaves and 7 baskets are collected. The number 7 is symbolic of completeness in the Bible. Not just Jews, but Gentiles too. And the number 7 is evocative of the 7 days of creation when God created all humanity. So what is the significance of the 2 feeding of the multitudes? Both miracles show the compassion and generosity of Jesus, his love for all his people, both Jew and Gentile. And if there's ever been a time in this world when our Jewish friends and the people of Israel need God's love and God's care and need Gentiles willing to sit with them in their pain in these days. But likewise, others would say it's also an unbelievable time for our love for the Palestinian people, not the Hamas, not the evil ones, but for those who live and trying to live a peaceful life in the West Bank and in Gaza. Taking the 5 loaves and bread and 2 fish, he blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And in turn, they gave them to the people. That better be from God. Could be, you know, Laura. Where else in the church do you hear these words? Of course, in the Eucharist, in Holy Communion. Some Sundays I refer to communion as a meal, and we share it with each other. For folks who don't equate Holy Communion with the atonement, with the blood part of this story, then maybe this meal of Jesus provides to the thousands gathered on the hillside might be a better image for why we gather around this table once a month. A meal of love shared out of compassion of Jesus Christ. Of course, then you have the issue of the so-called miracles of Jesus, taking just 5 loaves and 2 fish and multiplying that little bit of food for thousands. But alas, I guess that's a topic for another time. There's a fantasy story or a myth that goes around that says, how did Jesus really do this? And that all the people had a little bit of food, but they were reluctant to share it. And once Jesus set the model and some of the people started to share, it invited and inspired others to share, and therefore they had all this food. That's the story. I'm just saying. Look, like other miracle stories, when you get caught up in trying to explain the story in empirical terms, it loses the power and meaning of the story as told in the Gospels. But Jesus doesn't just miraculously meet the food and hunger needs of the people. No, before he does that, he has a conversation with the disciples about the meaning of this story. As always, Jesus is using miracles to get something more across. Jesus doesn't simply do the miracle, but first instructs the disciples to give the people something to eat. And so Jesus does give them something to eat. He gives them physical food, but he gives them spiritual food and nourishment, spiritual nourishment, and inspiration to bring some hope in their lives. For me, it means there is a deeper spiritual basis for the acts of generosity and compassion when we share with others. What I think I am trying to say this morning is that our stewardship campaign is not the same as a financial campaign run by a community group or organization. The call to generosity, to compassion, the call to being an active member of a faith community, this faith community, is the call to put our best spiritual selves into the checks we write to the church. And the time we spend in church activities doing the work that we are called to do. Like going to the community table tonight, the soup kitchen as it was called, and serving a meal. Or singing in the choir, teaching Sunday school class, cleaning this building, getting it ready eventually for a new pastor. There is a dynamic and organic connection between what we do and why we do it as we live out our faith in the church and community. And maybe, just maybe, it works the other way as well. By being generous and grateful and compassionate and living out our faith here in church, our spiritual lives are deepened and enriched. May it be so for you and for me this day. Amen.